Good evening, everyone from around the world, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. Welcome to our Old Masters New Generation Panel Forum. My name is Juliet Lloyd-Cox, and I'm one of a team of 3 studying for an MBA degree in Art and Collecting Management at IESA Arts and Culture School in Paris. Our theme for the panel discussions is to demystify Old Masters, to make Old Masters more relevant today, to share knowledge and experiences between older and younger collectors, and to inspire and engage the young collector. The topic of our first discussion tonight is to introduce Old Masters and its place within the art market, to look at matters like attribution and provenance. Our moderator is Megan Corcoran, who is an ex-banker from Wall Street, also well known as the Old Masters researcher for the annual Art Tactic Report, an associate director of Stephen Ogpen Fine Art Dealership in St James in London, and is also involved as accounts manager for London Art Week. Before I pass over to Megan, I just want to go through a few logistical things. I would like you to all look top right of your screen in the information sidebar, and you'll see a poll tab. If you wouldn't mind quickly responding to each of those 3 poll questions so we can gauge who is in the audience tonight. Also, to note that we're going to definitely have a Q&A session at the end, so please see the questions tab as well alongside the poll tab, and then during the course of the discussion you can add your questions. You can also, if you see a question that another attendee has actually written in the box and you'd like to hear that one answered, you can also upvote that. There's a facility there. So thank you. So without further ado, I'll pass you on to Megan, and she will introduce the panel and start the discussion. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you, Juliet, for the introduction. So I am now going to introduce our 4 panelists. So first we have Mr. David Exsurgin, who is a professor of art and film history at the University of Leicester, having previously worked at Christie's. He is a well-known authority on Italian Renaissance paintings and drawings, and is the co-organizer of the National Gallery's Raphael exhibition that was supposed to be this year, sadly, but will now take place in 2022. Next, we have Mr. Will Corner, who is the manager of international art fairs at the Art Loss Register, leading the vetting teams at TAFAF, Art Basel, and many of the other world's leading art fairs, working closely with both individual dealers and private clients. Will is also an antiquities specialist, working with governments, ministries, and archaeologists internationally to recover and repatriate cultural property. Next, we have Mr. Milo Dickinson, an Old Master painting specialist at Christie's in London, with a particular interest in Italian Renaissance and British art. Prior to joining the Old Master Paintings department, he was a specialist and head of department in European sculpture at Christie's as well. And finally, we have Ms. Delia Barman, who is the manager of marketing and business development at Art Discovery, which is a company focused on scientific analysis and technical art history in support of art authentication, where she leads customer and partner engagements worldwide. And Ms. Barman is also a guest lecturer at Sotheby's Institute of Art and Regents University, delivering sessions on the importance of value and art authentication. So again, thank you for joining us this evening to kick off the series of panel discussions with Old Masters New Generation. And from the poll, I can see that, many of you are relatively new to the art world. We have a lot of young collectors with us. So before we dive in, I will give a brief introduction to the genre. So no matter the situation, engaging with old master works, having a contextual understanding of the market is important. So in comparison to modern and contemporary art, the old masters can sometimes be a bit overlooked as we don't have as much glitz and glam. Just looking at the 2019 market, for the mainstream, with air quotes, market being the evening and day sales between Christie's and Sotheby's in New York and London. the Old Masters market brought in about $240 million, which for us sounds great. But when you look at it next to the post-war and contemporary market, or the modern market, some of those works, it's not entirely uncommon for a single piece to bring in between $50 and $80 million. So you can see why, some young collectors looking to get into the exciting art world might overlook us. In addition, it can be quite an overwhelming feeling to walk into an Old Masters auction preview, or to even open an Old Masters catalog, and feel as if you have no idea where to start, especially if you don't have the background in art history, which it is natural because the Old Masters as a genre covers over 500 years worth of art. So, different styles, different regions, different periods. Whereas, again, the other genres have a much more narrow focus. So on the whole, they're a bit easier to digest. And, the issue sometimes with Old Masters, people may be feeling that they're harder to engage with. Again, that makes sense because they're not of our time. They feel a bit further away. But all of that being said, that's why we are here tonight. So again, while understanding the history of the works and the time periods that they're from is definitely important, all of that information can be found in art history textbooks. But the one thing, as Juliet said, that we really want to focus on tonight is some useful skills for new collectors getting into the market. So to help you recognize and find value and understand what you're looking at. And a big part of that is understanding the difference between an artwork's valuation, given its price or its estimate at auction, and its market value, which is where it ultimately ends up selling. And there are some key elements to consider when looking at this and breaking down the valuation of an old master work. So in no particular order, there's quality, provenance, rarity, condition, medium, and authenticity and attribution. So before I run away with myself and a monologue, I think it's time to get our panelists involved. And in preparation for our discussion this evening, each panelist put together some examples from their varied careers and experiences to help demonstrate how each of these elements of valuation that I mentioned play out in a market setting and how they inevitably all overlap. So I'm sure we will all be chiming in as we go, but I thought first, let's start with David. The example that you wanted to cover was having come across an unattributed painting, which piqued your connoisseurial senses. So why don't you, walk us through the experience and what ended up happening?
Thank you. When I worked for Christie's, one of the things I most liked about that job was that I did a lot of traveling and went, effectively speaking, at the company's expense to places I would not normally have managed to get to. And on one occasion, I was in Germany with the regional representative for Hamburg, and we went to Hanover, and she said, right, there's just time to have lunch before we go and see the client. And I said, you can have lunch on your own. I've never been to Hanover, and God alone knows when I'll ever get back to Hanover. And you're going to drop me at the museum, and I'm going to run around the museum, and you can meet me, and then we'll go and see the client. And I walked into a room in the gallery in Hanover and literally started to run across the room because I was confronting this painting. It's a portrait, as you can see, of what we would normally call a Knight of Malta. That cross is distinctive of the Knights of Malta. In this guy's time, they were known as the Knights of Rhodes, in fact, as I subsequently discovered. And I immediately knew what it was even before I got close to it, for a simple reason, which is important as a way of working out who did something, namely that it's connected with another work. Very, very often, what you're recognizing is some sort of kinship between the work you're looking at and other things that you've seen in the past. And in this very particular case, there exists a drawing by Parmigianino for this portrait. That drawing is in Moscow. It was uncovered not so many years ago because it was on the back of a double-sided sheet of paper. The front was known, the back was not known. They unstuck it, and this portrait study was on the back, and it was the same guy with the same cross of the Knight of Malta. So I got incredibly excited. I then closed in on it, and we've already heard about quality, and I had no doubt that this wasn't just some kind of copy of whatever painting Parmigianino might have made out of his drawing. It was the original. There were changes of mind, alterations to contours, all the things that you expect to see. And therefore, it became pretty clear what it was. I also managed to look at the label on the wall, and it didn't say Parmigianino, which I wasn't surprised about because it certainly wasn't in any book on Parmigianino. Just finally, because that was an amusing fluke, normally with Renaissance portraits, there's not all that much likelihood that you'll work out who the person is. But not very long after finding this portrait, I was rereading Vasari because somebody asked me to do an introduction to Vasari for Everyman's Library. And in the life of a painter, Giulio Romano, who was Raphael's closest pupil and follower, there was a reference to one of his frescoes in the Vatican, which included a portrait of Messer Mr. Niccolo Vespucci, Knight of Rhodes. And I read this, I think, on a train somewhere when I was again traveling, and this was before Google, and got intrigued and thought, well, when I go home, I'll look up and see whether by some fantastic fluke it's the same guy. And sure enough, it was. So that's who he is, and he's in fact some kind of a relation of Amerigo Vespucci, who's the person who gave us the name of America. So he's a fun guy, and I think he's just about my favorite discovery.
So, well, it sounds like it was quite serendipitous. Well, it was interesting that you walked into the museum and even the curators didn't know. Did you get to have a discussion with them about, well, you know, how it was missed? Or it sounds like you need to have kind of your mental library of images that you've seen. And Milo, I'm sure that you experienced this as well at Christie's at the moment. So as things are coming into the auction house, I mean, the volume that you guys work with, of course, you know, to be able to do that is, I mean, yeah, so how does that work for you guys when you're working, instead of approaching just one picture, when you have that many pictures coming to you?
Well, I was going to ask David, how long have you been working on Parmigianino before then?
Quite a long time. I first published an article on Parmigianino in 1983, and I guess this was about 1995 or something. So I had also been working on him before publishing the article. I've been working on Parmigianino for not quite 20 years.
I mean, David is the great expert on Parmigianino. Not every time do you have the great expert standing in front of the unknown picture by the artist, but it does happen at Christie's quite a lot. I mean, David was there a long time, and he will have loads of stories. But lots of unattributed or wrongly attributed works come into Christie's, and that is one of the great joys of working in the Old Master Market, is that so many, over the course of its history, a painting or a sculpture has lost its attribution, and it's a sort of detective work. It's a discovery process, and that process is bound up in learning about the pieces themselves, and it's you see it in every Christie's and Sotheby's sale, and at TFAF and all the art fairs, how many discoveries are made. It's just part of the process, and it's probably one of the most exciting parts of the market.
It's completely true, and I think the other thing worth emphasizing, especially since we're talking to new collectors, is that whereas if you ever read an article in a newspaper that says, as it were, new Shakespeare sonnet discovered or something along those lines, it always turns out to be a piece of junk. It's never for real. Amazingly enough, in our field, really, really major things turn up, well, every year and many times a year. And not just this book. When I published this portrait finally, which was easy because I was editing Apollo, so I submitted it myself and agreed to publish it. But it was published in an issue with another completely unknown Parmigianino portrait. And as Milo will confirm, Parmigianino is not, a tiny little minnow in the pool of Italian Renaissance art. He's a really major artist. And if this thing came to the market, it would be millions, not hundreds of thousands, even maybe tens of millions.
I'm sure.
So, well, David, you mentioned that every year tons of, unattributed and new and interesting things were coming to the market. Do you feel that that's something that's continuing to happen now, or, was kind of the heyday of 20 years past? Do you think that?
I think it's absolutely still going strong. One of the weird aspects of the internet, especially if, like me, your email address is not a secret. I mean, teaching in the university, your email address certainly should be public, and I want mine to be. But that means I think now 2 or 3 times a week, if not more often, people completely out of the blue get in touch with me and send me images of things. It has to be admitted, most of them are rubbish, but just every now and then there's something really major. And of course, dealers in the auction houses also bombard one in a nice way, and real major things come up. In 2018, I think, or 19 maybe, last year I published an article, completely new painting by Correggio, which was shown to me, as it happens, by people at Sotheby's.
Wow. And well, actually, this is kind of a good point to move on to, well, Milo, some of the examples that you had, 2 paintings that are actually coming up this season at auction, talking about attribution, and in discussion about the Parmigianino, David had mentioned he knew it wasn't a copy, he knew it wasn't after an original work. But well, if you wanted to walk us through these examples, and well, yeah, we can kind of just continue to go down that route.
Yeah, so here we have 2 oil sketches by John Constable, the great British landscape artist, and both, I sort of included them because they're both coming up for sale at Christie's in our sale in about a fortnight, and both of them, or so neither of them, have had a long tradition associated with Constable. The one on the right is a completely new discovery, and the one on the left has sort of long been thought to be by Constable's son, and it's only recently that it's been sort of affirmed up that it's actually, or sort of genuinely acknowledged that it's actually by John Constable. And so both of them are quite exciting new discoveries. And it's quite interesting having them both in the sale and having them both come to Christie's at a similar sort of time, and sort of looking at them in the warehouse side by side, because it gives you, I suppose I can give you an idea into our thinking on valuation by comparing and contrasting the two, because the one on the right is a sort of very quickly done oil sketch of Leighton Hall in the Lake District, which Constable did very early in his career, in about sort of 1806, just as he was starting out doing these little oil sketches. And the one on the left, you're looking into an old mill shed in Dedham, which is in Suffolk. It's Constable's hometown. And you're looking through the shed to see a little boy, and there's sort of water running behind him, a little pond. And this was done sort of mid-career in 1816, when Constable was a lot more confident with these oil sketches. And we sort of looked at them, and we weren't sure. We were sort of, everyone had a different opinion in our department about which one was more valuable, which one was more appealing. And the one on the right is sort of typical of what you'd expect from a constable. It's more than just a study of a house. It's a study of light. It's a study of weather. The brush strokes are very liquid, but it is quite early on in his career, so he hasn't got the same master as he does later on, like in the old mill shed sketch. And the one on the left, we got really excited because we had it cleaned, and it just cleaned amazingly. And that, even though there are a lot of people in our department who've had decades of experience in the field of old masters, they thought, oh, it might look good after cleaning, but it looked amazing after cleaning, and everyone was suddenly like, wow, we've got a seriously good work by Constable on our hands here. And so, talking about value, I don't know what David, which one do you think is more appealing, left or the right? Which one would you value as more? To put you on the spot, you're on mute.
I'm fine with being put on the spot. I don't normally do valuation anymore because it's so nice to be spared it as an academic. But I could have a different criterion, which I do use, which is stealability or ownability.
Yeah.
Or possibly Christmas presentability. If somebody wants to give me one, then personally, and it is to do with the subject and all of those aspects, I would go for the landscapey one rather than the mill building one. But it may well be that in terms of the market, I'm wrong on that.
See, that's actually interesting because I would have guessed it was the later work. Well, I guess Milo, it would be interesting to hear which one, because my thoughts behind it were, well, if it's one of his more mature works and potentially a bit of the discovery aspect, considering that it was cleaned, so it's kind of been hiding out there all this time.
Yeah.
Which one is more valuable?
Well, I mean, I don't know the answer. I know what we've said. I mean, Christie's, we've put a valuation on the one on the right of Leighton Hall of 80,000 to 120,000, and on the one on the left of 100,000 to 150,000. So we have said the one on the left is more valuable, but I don't know necessarily if that is what the final result will be. I would probably take the one on the left myself. I think it's more beautifully painted, more confidently painted, but the one on the right is more typical of what most collectors would want from Constable, and so it might be more appealing generally.
Well, so it just goes to speak about the point we brought up earlier, that the initial valuation is actually a very different thing from the market value. And unlike some more contemporary works, what's always very exciting about the old masters market especially with a new discovery, is there's no historical price point. So it's basically, whatever the market's appetite is at that moment. So yeah, that must be very exciting for you guys after having looked at it in the storeroom for so long, and now it's coming up for sale.
I mean, every object in the old mass market is unique. Every object is different. So studying them and valuing them and looking at them, you really have to look with sort of fresh eyes every time, and really sort of think about what's in front of you. And so I speak to colleagues. I have lots of friends in contemporary department, for example, at Christie's, and they do value slightly by numbers. It's sort of like a stock going up and down. You can see what this artist is doing, his 1960s work, and you can value almost by a sort of computer algorithm. Whereas with us, everything is just done on the touch and the feel and the look. And so it's a totally different market.
We did have a question about what the size difference is between the two works, which is just interesting to know at the moment. Other questions we can come back to at the end.
They are a pretty similar size. I think the one on the left is slightly larger.
Okay. Well, actually, to your point, it might be interesting. We'll get Delia's opinion and then move on to some of her examples. Just having to, and also this ties into David's example on Parmigianino. Like you said, you always have to look at each work individually with fresh eyes every time. So there's always a material and a physical examination, but sometimes as people are talking about more and more, we need to add some science into the equation, which is where Delia comes in. And I know David had mentioned, and Delia, if you just wanted to touch on this really quick, that for the Parmigianino, they knew it wasn't a copy because there were changes. I believe you have an example from Rembrandt about this, but before I steal your thunder, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, first, of course, as we know, there is a long tradition of copying. Sometimes artwork were produced by students as part of the training. From a scientific perspective, imaging can really help. Being able to see below the surface gives another layer of information. If there are abandoned compositions below, those can tell a lot in terms of historical context. An example that I want to make before the Rembrandt is a work we did analysis on a few years back, a painting by Watteau. When the painting was discovered, key scholars and connoisseurs had a lot of questions around the attribution of the piece. The fading of certain materials has caused changes in the appearance of the painting. And connoisseurs started asking themselves if more than one hand was involved, which would have been very unlikely, not to say impossible, as the artist didn't have a studio. By doing investigation, we were able to understand what colors have faded and how it changed the overall appearance of the painting, and to see that it was due to natural aging. Art historians were then able to understand what the painting would have looked like, and once this question was sorted, the artwork was successfully accepted by experts in the field, and eventually the piece was purchased by the Getty. So that's just a quick example to show you how imaging and scientific analysis can help with problems of issues around attributions. But now, in a broader theme, when talking about attribution and authenticity, I think that one of the key things for us, which is the most important, is to collaborate, to work with other people in the field. For example, we stepped in to look at things with foundation. We work a lot with connoisseur to keep out the fakes, yes, of course, but also to help with dating issues, to understand where something may have been made. We know that some artists, such as Van Dyck, used to travel around Europe and use different types of colors in different places. Looking for pentimenti is also very useful to distinguish if it's a first version or if it's a copy of an artwork. So that's why we are working closely with art historian, with connoisseur, to help them understand where to look at. So that's something that's extremely important. And another point to say here is that I think trends are changing. For a very long time, we had the trends of provenance and connoisseurship being the predominant information. That's still extremely important, but now science is being used alongside to allow connoisseurs to make their opinion. Science is also being used more and more to tell conservators, to help conservators with repairs and conservation. So there are really a lot of things that we can do. For example, we have this US client who collects old masters. He doesn't want to buy anything before we do an analysis. The main reasons are that he wants to get more information about what he's buying. He wants to understand very accurately the value of the piece. And the analysis that we do really informs his decision on when to bid, how much to bid. And sometimes, obviously, it also makes him change his mind and he doesn't want to buy anymore. But I think it's really around information, and especially for the next generation, that's something that's becoming more and more important. People want to have more data. They want to know more about the piece, about the object, about the context. They want to have an experience while buying. And I think that that's really something to keep in mind, especially for the next generation. Now, a last point I want to make about scientific analysis before I jump to my examples, which is a very important one, is that from a scientific perspective, there are a lot of tools in the bucket of science. An example that I really like to make is it's like going to the doctor. Let's say you have a broken leg. You go to the doctor, they will do an X-ray, they may do a CT scan, but if they don't interpret the results, it will mean nothing. And that's exactly the same with what we do. It's very important to have the right tools and the right technology, but without the context of technical art history, to be able to understand the techniques of the artists, when materials were available, and so on, it will be only data. So science is important, but being able to interpret and to place the result in a historical context is even more important. So now we can jump to two examples that I have here. I will start with the other one as I want to keep good news for the end. Okay. So that's Madonna of the Veil. It was once considered as a masterpiece by Botticelli when it first appeared in around 1930. But it was in fact a forgery made by Umberto Giunti with the intention to deceive. They did some scientific analysis on this work where they found achronistic material. One of the pigments found here was not commercially available until the 1860s. They also did an X-ray that showed that the panel was not prepared in the traditional way. So now that's a very sophisticated forgery, and it's not directly reproducing a work by Botticelli, but it's putting together elements from different paintings to create a new composition. And that unfortunately happens very often. But talking about forgery, it's a completely other panel. So let's move to the other example that I have.
Actually, Delia, I wanted to ask you a quick question about that, which I hadn't realized earlier. So you said that this work just appeared kind of in the 1930s. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. That's not a work we did the analysis on, just to make that.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, that's just interesting. Well, you know, as you were, sorry, not to interrupt the two examples, but I actually thought it might be interesting to get Will's point of view here, you know, from the provenance side. You know, for a work, I mean, well, of course, this did turn out to be a forgery, but for a work of this age, you know, coming from the Art Loss Register, how concerning would it be that you couldn't find any provenance before a certain point? You know, kind of how would you guys have tackled an issue like this?
Well, for something like that, we recognize, just as Milo and David has said, that of course there are plenty of old masters that have never been properly attributed and really do come out of nowhere. And I can't tell you the number of old masters that we are asked to research where the provenance available is Italian private collection since 2015. it's a scary number. It's a scary percentage of the old masters that come to us. In terms of the way that we approach something like that Botticelli is we would say, okay, well then that's quite interesting how it's been completely unknown for a long time. I mean, the fact that it was acquired by Samuel Courtauld or the Courtauld Trust would suggest that, of course, it was acquired quite a while ago anyway. But I always draw the example of, to go back to Constable, the Constable that was restituted from the Tate a few years ago from by the Spoliation Advisory Panel that we have in the UK. That Constable was in a Noble collection in the UK and known to be in a Noble collection in the UK from the day it was painted, essentially up until the 1920s, the 1930s, reappears on the market in the 1950s in London, all the way up to today. And obviously the fact that, you know, it has all of that provenance didn't alleviate the fact that it was sold to a Hungarian nobleman and it was repatriated to Hungary a few years ago, having only ever spent 15 years in its entire sort of life in Hungary. So it unfortunately we completely recognize there's just not much information available. And as Delia says, forgery is just something probably for another panel when her and I can talk about provenance, stolen art and forgery quite extensively.
Yeah, so we need another 2 hours to to discuss forgery. But sorry for the sidetrack. Well, Delia, if you wanted to move to your next example, I just thought that was an interesting point for us to bring up.
Okay, so here we have a late work by Rembrandt. The work was documented since the mid-18th century. Then the picture disappeared from the public eye in the 1930s and re-emerged in 2010. It was rediscovered by Arthur Wheelock in an American private collection. The work had a very complicated condition because of the past cleaning and the restoration, which created a lot of doubts from scholars on attribution. Wheelock did a thorough reassessment of the painting as he was convinced that it was a work by the master himself. We then assisted in the process, and we were able to support his opinion, especially thanks to the fact that we saw the presence of a quartz ground that was very specific to the artist. Also, all the pigments were very consistent. And as you can see on the right side, the reuse of another portrait as support that was cut down and rotated is also in line with the artist's working method. So thanks to all this information, they were able to confirm that the artwork was by the artist himself, and it was then sold in 2017 by Christie's. So that's just another example of how we were able to support the connoisseur assessment.
Well, so actually that would be interesting to jump to David really quick, because you had mentioned when you spoke about the Parmigianino that one of the reasons you knew it wasn't a copy was because there had been changes to the piece. So, you know, in the same way that Delia's company was supporting the connoisseurial the initial thoughts behind connoisseurship. So what was your process for the Parmigianino? Of course, you saw it and you recognized it, having had the exposure. And then what were the steps to bring it to a company like Delia's, perhaps?
Well, in the case of the Parmigianino, in fact, the changes of mind were on the surface.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
You can not infrequently, especially in oil paintings, see changes of mind, because as the pigment becomes more translucent over time, Delia will know much more about this than me, but anyway, as it were, you see that the finger was here and then it's gone to there, or whatever it may be, and you kind of have a ghost of one finger or thumb, and the other one is still there. And if you're copying, you don't do that stuff. There are also, of course, plenty of other cases where it's deep underneath And as with the Rembrandt, there's a really, in effect, another painting underneath, a completely different painting. So it's not even quite a change of mind, it's a kind of revisitation.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
You can, at the very least, being super cautious, say that's not a copy of something else, because you wouldn't start by doing the head of a woman sideways on just for fun and then put the Rembrandt on the top. So these kinds of clues are very, very important.
Absolutely. Well, so I'm just conscious of the time. So we do have quite a few questions filtering in. But, I thought a good way to kind of end at least the panel in terms of looking at some of our pictures, that we would move over to Will. So, while we've been focusing so much on the artwork itself, we did have Will chime in for a bit on the Botticelli, but, the history of the piece is also so important. So, Will, did you want to touch on some of your examples, about repatriation and how important provenance is when you're actually, approaching a piece?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, firstly, to sort of go through very briefly from my sort of vetting side, working with a lot of the biggest fairs, I think the nicest thing about everything that we've spoken about, that's hopefully become clear, is that it's a process. That you have people like Milo and David looking at objects with their knowledge and their expertise and saying, hold on, I think this might be by this person, or I think there might be a slight restoration issue here, or there's something that's caught my eye that I should get people to look at. And that way you call in Delia, that's where you call in other scientists, other experts to come and help you to look at what you're looking at. And the vetting process is absolutely fascinating. This is what happens for any of you who's not sure what that means. Before a lot of the biggest art fairs in the world open, you've got all these dealers coming in from all around the world, all selling different kinds of things. And you have vetting committees of experts. You quite often have a scientific machine or two to help you sort of guide the experts to make sure that everything is as good as it can be. And they have some very interesting debates. I mean, it's not just about, is this definitely by this artist? It's things like, here's an Irish table. Now, the top seems to be in perfect condition, and it seems to be a fantastic example of late 19th century Irish woodwork, but the bottom seems to be completely restored. Now, does that mean that it can't be shown? Or does it mean it needs to be relabeled? Or should it be scientifically analyzed to make sure it's not just someone's eye that's sort of deceiving them? So the actual process is absolutely fascinating. And when you put provenance into everything else that we've talked about, it is absolutely crucial, because you've talked about connoisseurship, you've talked about attribution, authenticity. Well, the simple, easiest way for you to sort of be semi-certain in what you have is to have a sort of established and well-recognized provenance. And Meg, you said that not everyone can be expected to have a mental library of images. Or Milo said you can't always have the expert in front of every artwork that you can come across. But provenance is one of the main things that hopefully will keep that information that Delia also referred to, so that the next generation can really know what they have, and can indeed bring in their own process of just making sure that they're keeping track of things. From my point of view of the Art Loss Register, this is a Hubert Robert drawing that was sold a couple of years ago at a major auction house. It's been recovered by us after it had been stolen in Belgium in 2002. Now, it's not a particularly valuable drawing. It's sold for at auction a couple of years ago for €8,000. But what I wanted to sort of share with you is that, provenance and I hate to say it, but stolen art, which is something that, of course, we specialize in, is a never-ending issue. It's something that we will all inherit. And I mean, we have 700,000 objects listed as lost or stolen on our database, so it's only a matter of time for objects to come up. But that is maybe not a problem, that it can just be dealt with at that point. So moving on to my second slide here, which is just a couple of pictures actually that I picked at random. One is with Megan's gallery, Stephen Ongpin Fine Art, in the top left. And the bottom right was one of Milo's star lots from his auction at Christie's at the end of last year. Now, those are two works that have been restituted, have been subject to settlements with owners that suffered losses in the period 1933 to 45, which is, of course, a very problematic period for losses. Millions of objects went missing in that period. Now, those objects still come up on the market all the time. And these are two artworks that have had those claims settled. And as a result, they can be sold with full provenance back to the 1930s, if not beforehand. We now know a lot more about these artworks' histories. We now know that these issues have been dealt with, and perhaps they may even be a positive selling point. Not to put Milo on the spot at all, but you look at the art newspaper article about the panel, which indeed was after the sale, but it sold for 3 times, I believe, its estimate. And we don't know what makes people buy things, but some people do like a good story. So there are both positive and negative issues to provenance, but most importantly, we've just got to make sure that we keep a better handle on it and keep making sure that experts look at these things and that information is kept.
I mean, can I just pop up? I mean,
please do.
A lot of people ask me, why does it matter? Or sometimes ask me, why does it matter who owned an artwork before? And apart from obviously the sort of romance of owning something that someone with taste and a great collector owned before them, I think there's definitely, especially in the old master market, a great appeal in owning something that's had a long and settled provenance. Let's say it's been in an English country house collection hanging on the wall above the fireplace for 200 or 300 years. Then you know that it hasn't gone through lots of different hands, it hasn't gone to lots of different restorers, and it hasn't been changed and transformed. And I think that having had a settled provenance, it gives a lot of assurance to collectors. And I think if, in the case of the Giuliano Di Paolo, which I think sold for sort of 5.3 million last year, it did come from, it's been in a museum collection as well. It's been through these great collectors' hands. And I think that also gives reassurance that people of discernment have given their backing to this picture in the past. So not only is it obviously a great picture, but everyone's thought about that it's been a great picture for a long time. So that always helps in the market value.
Well, so I think now actually kind of bringing everybody's examples and experiences together, we have quite a few interesting questions that I might just start throwing out at everybody. I hope you have your hard hats on. But someone has asked, at what point does a work's provenance move from suspected to be by an artist to officially by an artist? So, I think there's a lot of different elements to this question, but, how often do you guys find that these, more optimistic attributions have been made falsely, or, for an auction house, or David as an art expert, where would you try and be more cautious, or at what point would you really affirm a new attribution?
Well, I think what you're trying to do is to express an opinion. And one of the things that I made an absolute rule at a very early point was never to receive really even plane ticket for the inspection of a work of art, far less any kind of material reward for an opinion. I much later on discovered how wise I was when somebody suggested they'd give me £1 million to change my mind about the attribution of a work which I had told them was not by Parmigianino, as it happens.
Wow.
There is, you can see, I think fairly obviously, there will be some cases where you're absolutely confident, at least in your own mind, that you know what it is. There are some rather knife-edge ones where you think, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I've definitely, I would say, got it wrong on occasions, not least, for instance, when things get cleaned and reveal more of their true nature. So underestimating, it can go the other way. You can overestimate, but you're just trying to give your best shot. There is a very beautiful story in Vasari, just in case anybody thinks that everybody can get it right, where he tells the story of Giulio Romano, whom I mentioned, in fact, earlier, being shown a copy of a Raphael portrait, a famous portrait of Leo X, Pope Leo X and two cardinals, which is now in Florence. And he's shown a copy which is by another distinguished artist, Andrea del Sarto. And he starts in on, yes, well, I remember when Raphael painted this and da. Sorry, actually, this is the copy. Well, if he can't crack what's a Raphael, when he was working with a guy, we have to be a bit cautious about reckoning we're always right. If we're giving it our best shot at any time, and dare I say it, naming no names, but individual artists are often associated with individual experts, and some of the experts are better than others.
So buyers beware.
It's a reason for caution, shall we?
Yes, yeah. Well, kind of along those lines, I think this question is pointed a bit at Milo and Delia, but we're being asked, what is the current future of scientific analysis in terms of progress in methods and how readily they'll be available to the old masters market? I know in my experience, it's very easy to go into an auction preview and ask to see something under UV or raking light. But, of course, some of the methods that Delia has discussed, of course, you can't just necessarily do that in the back room of Christie's. So, what's both of your views in terms of the progress in science and availability?
I mean, in my case, you can definitely see that there's the trend is that it's being used more and more. We're being asked to do a lot more, to get a lot more scientific analysis of major paintings before the sale. So it's changing year by year, and it's definitely had a big impact, and a lot more collectors are more aware and more understanding of it. I think that some people in the marketplace are overconfident about the use of scientific analysis. It requires a lot of expertise in itself, and I'm sure Delia will tell us a lot more than she probably knows a lot more about this than me. But what do you think, Delia?
Yeah, as I said earlier, you really need to know how to use the tools that you have, and that's the most important thing. We have a lot of techniques that we use, especially with Old Master, from C14 analysis to be able to date the support and so on. But really, as I said earlier, if you don't have the right experts with the great background and they don't know how to interpret the results, then it will mean nothing. So that's the key things, to be able to understand the context, to be able to put the information into context.
There's actually an interesting question has come through kind of about the price point of scientific analysis. So, Milo, you had mentioned for some of the bigger pictures in your sales that you do try to do the analysis up front. Is there kind of a barrier to entry right now with the scientific analysis in terms of expense?
There are different techniques at different prices. So it really depends the kind of information that you want. We have a lot of clients that come to us just to have some imaging done, to have an X-ray, an infrared, and that will be a certain price. Then if you have someone who comes with the idea of selling the work, so he will need to have as many information as possible, then we will need to do a full study that will obviously be more expensive. But it really depends on the level of certainty that someone needs to have and the different things that they want to understand. It really depends on the question people have and want answered.
Milo, did you have any thoughts on that coming from the auction house background?
Yeah, I mean, because it does cost money, and even if it's £500, it tallies up. You can't do it on every painting, so it's more. We focus more on the higher value paintings and the paintings where we have more time. If they come in prior to a sale with some time, and also, if a painting has a visible underdrawing or something, we will want to look at it more closely and see what's underneath the paint surface. And if obviously there are question marks then we might do a scientific analysis. When I was in the Old Master Sculpture department, there are certain materials like ivory and terracotta that you can test, which will give an indication of age. So we would do it on lots of those, just because it became so de rigueur for important works. So it depends, like everything, case by case basis.
And I think another important thing to say in terms of pricing is that it can be a huge return of investment. That's what client really needs to understand. If the price is high, and I think it's too high, they don't think about what they can have if the results are actually what we want to receive.
I think there's one other thing maybe worth saying, which is that scientific tests, like the tests on the Botticelli, prove it's wrong. Scientific tests that get you back to the period don't tell you who it's by. And I have frequently been bombarded by incredibly cross owners who say, but I've had all these scientific tests which prove it's in the lifetime of Leonardo da Vinci. And I have been known to reply, yeah, but as a matter of fact, it might be Kevin or Barry da Vinci instead of Leonardo. They were around at the same time as well, and you haven't proved anything beyond when, not who. And who tends to be rather important in our area.
Absolutely. That's why we need to work with connoisseurs and with art historians to have the right answer. It's not enough to have science. It's just something that complements the results that we already have and that give more certainty and give more certitude.
Well, I'm not sure that we could have ended on a better point if I had tried to script that. But thank you all so much for being with us this evening. Juliette just had a few parting words for everybody before we officially signed off. But well, thank you from me and for our panelists, guys. Thank you very much for everything you had to contribute tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank
you. Juliette, were you going to come back on?
Sorry. Thank you very much, Megan, and all the speakers. Very, very interesting, very informative. There's a lot more questions there that we'll have to answer, and we'll put those on our website definitely next week because it's a very interesting one there. I just really wanted to please thank our project tutors as well, Emmanuel, Sonia, Kristen Grant, and Eileen Stuff for supporting our project and for making this night possible. And also just to remember to please register if you haven't already for day 2 of our panel discussion series. Same time tomorrow. It's all about collectors and collecting. older collectors exchanging ideas and experiences with younger collectors. So hopefully we'll see you there. Thanks again to everybody, all the speakers, and have a great evening. Goodbye.